Hello, welcome to the introductory presentation on data privacy. Today we have here myself, Janice Parson, and my co-presenter, Ashley Brown. In this session, we'll be discussing the impact of data privacy on consumers, employees, and organizations at large. To briefly introduce myself, I'm Janice Parson. I'm a VP within RGP's Advisory and Project Services team, and I lead a number of cross-functional initiatives within finance, accounting, and risk and compliance. My focus is on technology and finance process design, risk management, and continuous improvement for companies. To briefly introduce RGP, RGP is a global consulting company that serves over 2,400 clients, which includes over 75% of the Fortune 500. RGP enables rapid business outcomes by bringing together the right people who together create transformative change.
Hello, everyone.
Ashley?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Brown, and I am a director within RGP's cybersecurity and data privacy practice. And I work with our clients to assess their data privacy and cybersecurity programs, identify risks, mitigate them, and create roadmaps for compliance with both privacy regulations and cybersecurity frameworks. I have been a part of RGP for almost 3 years, and prior to that, I was part of PwC's and Booz Allen Hamilton's cybersecurity and data privacy related teams.
Great, thank you, Ashley. So what we like to talk about today is, from a data privacy perspective, the consumer perspective and the impact to organizations, and then also organizational challenges and the lessons learned. And I will kick off in terms of talking about from a consumer perspective. So in terms of data privacy and market trends, traditionally, individuals and consumers think about data privacy pertaining to personal records, such as your social security number, your date of birth, or perhaps biometric records. But now, data includes a variety of things, such as what's on social media, like your personal views, your news, your connections, or maybe even your browser searches. And now event-driven data, such as the request for vaccination information from employers in the last 1 to 2 years, there's just so much data associated with an individual. And according to Forbes and International Data Corp, from 2010 to 2020, the amount of data created, captured, copied, and consumed in the world increased from 1.2 trillion gigabytes to 59 trillion gigabytes. It's almost a 5,000% growth. The amount of digital data created in the next 5 years will also double. Now, although only a small percentage of the data created is stored and retained each year, this is still a significant number. And with the increasing collection and the creation of the data, there's also an increasing distrust by consumers on privacy. And in some cases, it's also deterring consumers from using products or services. What individuals want is to have some control over their personal information and how it's collected and used. So what does this mean for organizations? It's even more important today to have an established privacy program in place in order for employees and consumers to be able to trust that the data collected are handled appropriately. Now, many are interested in terms of from a consumer perspective on data privacy, and several organizations have surveyed on this. According to Pew Research Center, a survey that was conducted with over 4,000 adults in 2019 to research about America's views on privacy, 52% of US adults surveyed decided not to use a product or service because of concerns on how much personal information would be collected. And adults who experienced data breaches were also more likely to avoid the products or services out of privacy concerns. And then what was also interesting was that of the adults surveyed who decided not to use the product or services, over 70% of that believe that all or almost all of what they do online or while using a cell phone is being tracked by advertisers, tech companies, or other companies. Now, Cisco also conducts a consumer privacy survey annually, and in 2021 gathered data that included approximately 2,600 adults in 12 countries. And participants were also asked about their attitudes and activities regarding a company's use of the personal information. The top highlights from the surveys were that from the results, the consumers want transparency as well as control with respect to the business data practices. But for those, in terms of as nearly half feel like they're unable to effectively protect their data, not knowing how their information is used, but for those who decide to take action to protect their data, they do eventually terminate use over privacy concerns. So consumers are concerned about the use of personal information in AI and automated decision making. And also, abuse has also eroded trust. And as we talk about AI, there are a lot of benefits to AI and decision making, utilizing technology to make advancements such as improving finance monthly close and operational customer service functions to reduce repetition and human error, as well as predicting preferences in streaming services or weather patterns to provide better user experience or more accurate information. But there's also been unethical use of AI and simply concerns over unintended biases from AI, such as when someone is seeking loan approval or job interview. And when AI is utilized to contribute to more personal decisions, more consumers will question the automated decision-making process. Now, going back to the consumer survey by Cisco, it was interesting how Cisco had surveyed, and that Cisco had provided 6 different use cases to test the respondents' reactions where personal data would be involved in the automated decision-making situations. In the example, the least trusted scenario was having to infer your mental health status and recommend counseling services. The second least trusted scenario was an example process to select you for a job interview. And then with the most trusted service in terms of matching a sales representative. As you can see, the more personal decision the use case is, the less the individual is to trust the company if the suggested decisions are generated by AI. And according to McKinsey, a 2021 survey was conducted with approximately 2,000 Americans asking the question, do you believe companies are using your personal information responsibly? Only 1/3 of the respondents believe that companies are currently using their data responsibly. I would still say what's the key point here is that consumers want transparency and some control over how their personal information is managed and used. And this is also applicable to AI. Now, after sharing the consumer perspective on data privacy, what does this mean for organizations? First of all, it's important to provide transparency to consumers and users, as mentioned earlier. And to provide transparency, it's key to have organizations' data lifecycle well established and be able to articulate those activities through consent, a privacy policy, or statement. So when we talk about a data lifecycle, what does this entail? In general, the phases of the data lifecycle are shown here: collection, processing, use, disclosure, retention, and destruction, and with the general activities and examples described. What I like to highlight, though, is the collection phase and the use phase today. In the collection phase, data should be obtained with the knowledge in terms of consent of the data subject. And the two key elements mentioned here, obtaining consent and communicating a privacy policy or notice, are the ways to be able to help provide transparency to the remaining phases of how data is collected, handled, and used. Now, interesting enough, recently, one of the significant developments pertaining to this phase is around the collection of data by organizations that do not directly interact with the consumers or data customer. It's often referred to as the third-party data. And the data are often shared or bought and sold on data marketplaces or exchanges. The major development has been to push from regulators and tech companies to reshape how data can be collected from third parties, which has a significant impact to marketers. There's a growing trend from tech companies to remove third-party cookies from browsers and third-party access to unique identifiers for devices. Apple developed the App Tracking Transparency feature for devices in 2021, which requires apps to ask for permission to track users' activity across other companies' apps and websites. And Google is exploring alternatives to third-party cookies on Chrome, as well as unique identifiers on Android. We should keep an eye out on these developments. In terms of use, it depends on the organization and the data collected. But ultimately, use is limited to consent, or essentially limited to the purpose defined. But this is where organizations should be transparent about its use, as discussed earlier, and with examples shared from Cisco Consumer Privacy Survey. I do want to add that as companies align to regulatory requirements and have the duty to address an individual's inquiries, the other phases are also relevant to individual user or consumer requests. In processing, examples may be to improve data quality, to transform unstructured data to structured data for readability. But also, this is where an individual is requesting to correct associated information if the company is a record keeper. With retention and destruction, organizations should retain personal information only as long as is necessary to fulfill the stated purpose, as described in its privacy policy, and delete upon term expiration, or at least have the ability to delete upon an individual's request prior to the term expiration. It's also important to provide consumers the confidence that their data will be secure, and through data protection and proper security management. Because of this, I also just want to note to consider the risk around the task or functions being outsourced, such as what data the third party handles and what is necessary to conduct due diligence to manage the security risk involved with the third parties and address any key stakeholder concerns. Now, I'd like to pass this over to Ashley to touch upon data protection and talk about the challenges that organizations encounter in establishing and maintaining a privacy program. Ashley?
Great. Thank you, Janice. Thank you for sharing that foundational knowledge on privacy with us. What I'd like to do now is step us through some of the challenges that organizations have faced at the beginning of the pandemic, as well as today when it comes to data privacy. As you may have heard in our previous video series on cybersecurity, cyber attacks and data breaches are at an all-time high due to the rapid transition many organizations were forced to make to support a work-from-home model and remote workforce due to the pandemic environment. According to the Verizon 2021 Data Breach Investigations Report, respondents from over 80 countries indicated that nearly 30,000 security incidents and just over 5,000 data breaches had occurred. The same report also stated that personal data was the second most sought after data type, as it is used for financial fraud and has a high resale value for cyber criminals. It's important to note, however, that not all data breaches are malicious, as there are also scenarios where employees will make mistakes, which can result in the misuse of personal information. So what we can glean from this information is that despite organizational efforts to protect the integrity and confidentiality of personal data, hackers are still a threat and data breaches still occur. So it's important for organizations to reassess their data privacy and cybersecurity programs to continue to strengthen its protections surrounding personal data. Next slide. So in addition to cyber threats resulting in data breaches, the number one challenge organizations have faced and still face is the ever-changing privacy regulatory landscape. Before COVID, many organizations were still implementing privacy compliance measures to meet the requirements of two key regulations. The first being the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, and secondly, the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA. The GDPR was born out of the EU, and it is the most expansive and strictest privacy regulation to date. And it has really set the standard for privacy regulations on the world stage. While this went into effect in May of 2018, some companies were still engaged in compliance efforts at the beginning of the pandemic. In the US, we had the CCPA, which is modeled after the GDPR, and it is the broadest and strictest privacy regulation in the US, and it went fully into effect in January of 2020. Both the GDPR and the CCPA alone have had a great impact on the way organizations set strategies for data protection prior to COVID. As this map shows, however, there are even more laws to consider worldwide, and even within the US, there are a multitude of state laws to consider as well when it comes to meeting data privacy and protection requirements. On a global scale, Brazil passed the Brazilian GDPR in September of 2020, but the administrative sanction provisions of this law went into effect in August of 2021. More recently, in China, the recent Personal Information Protection Law was passed in August of 2021, and it is the first comprehensive data privacy law in China based on China's constitution. This went into effect in November of 2021, and it was announced as a real game changer for companies in China. Next slide, please. In the US, some of the more recent privacy laws include the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act, which was signed into law in March of 2021 and goes into effect in January of 2023. Colorado also passed the Colorado Privacy Act in July of 2021, and it goes into effect in July of 2023. And even more recently, Utah became the fourth US state to pass a comprehensive privacy law titled the Utah Consumer Protection Act. But overall, this law aligns closely with the Virginia Consumer Privacy Protection Act, but it is more a business-friendly approach to consumer privacy as compared to California, Colorado, and Virginia. As you can imagine, having a more global or remote workforce due to the pandemic has created greater challenges for compliance, both with global privacy laws as well as state laws in the US. Next slide. There have been a number of challenges faced by organizations when it comes to managing robust privacy programs in more recent years. In addition to the changing regulatory landscape that we just discussed, companies who had not gone through GDPR had to implement enhancements to their privacy programs for the first time. This included activities such as enabling individual rights requests so that individuals could request access to or erasure of their data along with various other rights. Another activity was performing data inventories to better understand what data elements were collected, processed, and stored within the organization. And then also ensuring that there are processes in place to provide breach notifications within mandated timelines. Additionally, compliance with the CCPA has proven to be a moving target. The CCPA has undergone numerous revisions since it was first drafted, and it is now actually called the California Privacy Rights Act, or CPRA. The CPRA affords more privacy rights than its predecessor, the CCPA, and it also established the California Privacy Protection Agency to enforce the regulations, mandates, and impose fines on non-compliant organizations for the first time. Even with all of those changes I just described, the final implementing regulations aren't even set to be released until July of this year and could be pushed back even later. Additionally, regulators are not adjusting timelines for meeting compliance. So again, with our California Consumer Privacy Act example, despite pleas from various industries such as the advertising world, the California Attorney General did not provide an extension for companies to be compliant with the CCPA. We also saw new uses of PHI, or personal health information. So the new type of PHI businesses had to deal with was information related to COVID health status and vaccine status. Companies had to balance competing priorities, such as the need to protect the privacy of employees' private health information, while also maintaining a healthy work environment and complying with constantly changing local and federal pandemic-related shutdown requirements. Enforcement activities also did not slow over the last couple of years. For example, the Irish DPC, which is the primary EU overseer of Facebook, Google, Twitter, and other tech giants, fined WhatsApp a record-breaking $267 million for violating the GDPR and failing transparency obligations, according to a recent ISACA survey. This fine, however, was dwarfed by the $886 million GDPR fine proposed against Amazon by the Luxembourg National Commission for Data Protection in July of 2021 for unlawful processing of personal data. More recently, we've seen a trend for privacy programs being understaffed. So according to the same ISACA survey, 55% of technical privacy and 45% of legal privacy positions were understaffed, which is an increase of 46% and 33% respectively. Closely linked with that challenge was an increased demand for privacy professionals. It was reported that 63% increase for legal privacy roles, and then a 72% increase for technical privacy roles. Also related is a trend for skill gaps. So 64% of survey respondents indicated that experience with different types of technologies and or applications for privacy management activities was lacking within their privacy programs, and 50% of respondents also indicated that having a robust understanding of the laws and regulations their organization was subject to was also lacking, again, due to the changing requirements and mandates. Next slide. So what are some key program gaps of data privacy that we've seen since the start of the pandemic? And in other words, what's gone wrong and how can it be fixed? So some lessons learned. In a recent IAPP survey, companies reported that in-depth privacy reviews for new technologies were skipped or shortened. This becomes an issue because if companies do not know what data is being collected on individuals, where it's housed, or have measures in place to protect that information, they could be slow to respond during a data breach and potentially not meet mandated deadlines for notifying individuals of a breach. We also saw an increased collection of protected health information resulting from COVID, which also increases the risk of that data for cyber attacks. So as I mentioned earlier, such data points as whether a person had experienced COVID-19 symptoms, whether anyone in their household had experienced symptoms, whether a person had traveled recently, whether they had been diagnosed with COVID-19, or whether they had been vaccinated for COVID-19, were all new types of PHI, and that was collected by organizations, which allowed more access for cyber criminals to personal information, and the increase that this information could be targeted and potentially breached. We also saw potential for infringement of privacy rights. So this is closely linked to the next point of that we saw an increase of third-party data sharing without the proper controls in place. For example, having verbiage in third-party agreements around security controls and measures. For example, here, some organizations earlier on in the pandemic were asked to share data to assist with contact tracing. And in these cases, some businesses shared actual names of employees who had tested positive for COVID-19 instead of anonymizing this data in an effort to make this data more available at a swift pace. As for leading practices, some things that an organization can do, but it's facing some of these data privacy challenges today, include performing some of the following key privacy risk mitigation activities. The first being embedding privacy by design principles, such as assessing newly adopted tools and technologies to understand what personal information is being collected and identify any privacy risks. This also includes enforcing principles such as limiting the use of personal data or limiting access to this data as well. Additionally, anonymizing COVID-related employee health data or ensuring other safeguards are in place would help protect this information. Clearly defining the privacy responsibilities of third parties and agreements. So typically this involves the legal department reviewing contracts to ensure they have in place those mandates that need to be there from a privacy perspective. Can also perform privacy audits to achieve compliance with applicable regulations. So this is to ensure that all applicable laws are accounted for by industry as well as geography. And finally, establishing and enforcing enterprise-level data protection policies and procedures to ensure that program practices are being communicated and utilized throughout the organization consistently can also lead to better privacy program results. With that, I will hand it back over to Janice, who will wrap up today's discussion.
Great, thank you, Ashley. What great insights on the privacy challenges and providing the leading practices. So to provide a quick recap, what we have talked about today is in terms of providing consumer perspective on data privacy, a high-level data lifecycle within a privacy program, the privacy regulatory landscape, as well as marketplace challenges and the lessons learned. Now, if you have any questions, we have left names on here in case you have questions and would like to contact. But this concludes our presentation for today, and thank you for watching.